Hey everybody, welcome back to the Badgerland Birding Podcast, bringing you birding news, stories, and information from the Badger State, which is Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Derek. Ryan is here with us as well. Today we're going to be talking about owls in honor of Super Bowl Sunday, which some people refer to as Superb Owl Sunday.
Yeah, I like without knowing that, just saying in honor of the Super Bowl, we're talking about owls.
Yeah, I feel like birders really love the play on words type thing. Like if there's ever one they can take advantage of, they're there.
Yeah, that's probably true. And I would rather talk about owls than talk about Taylor Swift or the Chiefs or the 49ers anyway.
Oh, this wasn't going to be a Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce, Brock Purdy podcast.
Well, it was, and then we decided to change it last minute, which is probably good for everybody.
Yeah, so we're kind of going to go through all the owls in Wisconsin that you could feasibly see, and then also just some other cool ones that we have on our life list. So Rye, what do you think makes owls so captivating? A lot of the times when you're out, people are always looking for owls, trying to take pictures of owls. What do you think makes them so fascinating?
I think there's a lot of things about owls that make them fascinating. I think number one, you don't see them very often because most of them are nocturnal. So there is an element of just rarity there. Even if the bird itself is not terribly uncommon, they're still uncommon to have an experience with on some level. And I think also the fact that they're more active at night gives them this sort of eerie allure where it seems like they're active when nothing else is, which is just kind of ingrained them into folklore and pop culture and given them that aspect of being kind of spooky.
Yeah, they've definitely ingrained themselves in pop culture with Harry Potter. I mean, the how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop owl? Owls have kind of
Duolingo.
been in Duolingo. Owls have been kind of in fashion lately too. They've been showing up on clothing and stuff. And obviously, if you are looking at an owl, you want to be ethical. You want to stay far away. You want to be aware that it's probably roosting, trying to hide from things. So definitely want to be respectful of all the owls out there that you may be looking for and seeing out in the field.
Also, don't you think owls are kind of weirdos? I mean, they can turn their head almost the entire way around. They have ears that are offset, not symmetrical. They have big ear tufts. They sometimes just sit there for hours at a time. They're sort of strange in general.
Yeah, and they're little goobers, little goofballs, but also they, could rip your face off, some of them if they want. But we're gonna start with the great horned owl, probably one that people know the best. And for those of you that are listening, we do have a picture of the owl pulled up, just kind of as a reference, but we won't really reference anything that you won't hear in the audio. But for those of you watching, you do have a visual kind of assistance here with each owl we're going to talk about in Wisconsin. So the great horned owl is probably one that most people encounter. I feel like they're the most frequent in backyards. They're huge. They have large ear tufts. They live pretty much throughout all of the continental US. And they are kind of your classic owl. They make that low hooting noise. Often they'll duet. In kind of the backyard where I'm at now, I've actually had them fly up and sit on the chimney and call. It sounds like they're inside the house. And for a second, you're like, where is that coming from? And it turns out they're sitting on the chimney.
Yeah, I think this is the owl that many people have their first owl experience with just because of the fact that they're numerous and they will be around backyards. Do you remember the first time that you saw a great horned owl or had an experience with a great horned owl?
Well, I remember that when we were at our parents' house, there was that one that would hang out on the bike trail that we kind of lived by. And I believe we named it Carson. And we would just sometimes see it. Sometimes we go out at night to look for it, and it would pop up and it would just be kind of this cool thing to look for and see. And then sometimes I'd be biking on that bike trail and it would be close to dark and you would see a shape swoop silently through. Be like, oh man, that's a great horned owl. So I think those are probably some of my earliest memories. What about you?
Yeah, I was trying to remember the first time that I ever actually heard one or saw one. I honestly can't remember it for some reason. But now, into our birding, we've seen them several times and around the neighborhood, you just encounter them. It still feels special every time that you see one. It's never like, oh, it's a great horned owl. It's always like, oh, cool, a great horned owl. That's awesome. Let's get a picture of it. Let's get a recording of it. Let's just look at it for a while. So even though they're an owl that we've had a lot of experience with, they haven't lost their luster, I guess. And one thing interesting about these is that there's also that northern Arctic version too, which is more white. It looks
Yeah,
drastically
that's super
different in terms of
cool.
the coloration. Yeah, it's like a snowy owl version of the great horned owl, which is really neat.
Yeah, those are super neat. with kind of the great horn, I think the added mystery is that they are often at night and they're so silent in flight that I think when you kind of get a glimpse of one, you feel like you're kind of catching them off guard, so to speak. Like I'm not supposed to be seeing you, but I've caught a glimpse of you, and that makes
Like
it
you
pretty
stumbled
cool.
into something that wasn't supposed to be happening
Yeah,
in
you're
a
like, I'm
back
not
alley
supposed
or
to know
back
that
room.
he's here, but I found him.
They're actually kind of gnarly too, so they're known for decapitating their prey items, and they'll also deal with things like skunks and porcupines and stuff that you wouldn't think a bird would
Well,
want to
and
be
they'll
dealing
eat
with.
other owls too, like smaller species.
I mean, a lot of the birds that are predatory will eat just anything smaller than them
Pretty,
for the most
yeah,
part.
pretty much anything that can fit in something's mouth, they'll go for, pretty much.
Yeah,
So here's kind of the range map of the great horned. Literally everywhere in the continental US you could find one. So
pretty
makes
much
sense why that would be
non-migratory.
people's first experience with an owl is probably going to be the great horned owl. Next up, we have, I would assume, is the second most common. I could be wrong, but
Um,
they do seem like they're fairly common. The barred owl.
they're one of the more common ones, I would say, especially dependent on the habitat. They're a
Let's look at
little
the
less
range
likely
map
in
real quick.
backyards.
So mostly eastern, although
Well,
that is
that's the
expanding now,
thing.
but it
There's a
was mostly eastern.
So we recently made a video about this actually. The barred owl's range expanded and started pushing out the spotted owl, which is native to the west coast of the United States. And so barred owls have now presented a problem for the spotted owl because they'll outcompete them for territory and sometimes even eat them or hybridize with them, which is kind of complicated. But now there's an initiative to try to eradicate the barred owls or at least severely limit the population that's in the western half of the United States. So they're kind of in the news lately, and there's a lot of debate about whether this should be happening or whether there's a different way to handle it, and so it goes. But the barred owl it was one of my favorite owls growing up because they just have a cool look about them with their patterning and their big, mostly solid black looking eyes.
Did something change or like they were?
Well, I think my life expanded into knowing about many other different owl species. It was kind of like the great horn, the screech, and the barred, and I always thought it would be really cool to see a barred. And now I've seen several of those, and they're actually one of the owls that will make their sounds during the day. So you'll hear them calling that "Who cooks for you" call, even when it's light out sometimes.
And they make some really wild, almost primate sounding vocalizations too. I've experienced a lot of barred owls in the Louisiana swamps, and that just feels like home. Like if you're in a swamp, you're like, there should be a barred owl somewhere here. But they make kind of these almost monkey sounding noises as well. And some people think that those noises account for some of the Bigfoot reports because they're hearing that and like, man, it sounds primate. And then people think there's a Sasquatch in the area.
That's interesting. I mean, I remember when I was down in Louisiana for a week and we were out birding, we encountered them in multiple places. So at least, two different occasions we heard or saw barred owls down there.
Yeah. Do you remember your first barred owl experience?
I think I do actually. I think that it was the first year that we were really birding. There was one that was seen pretty regularly in the Madison area on a place called Picnic Point. And I was looking for it with one of my friends. I don't even remember which friend it was. They weren't even a birder, but we were just out there looking for an owl. And somebody pointed out where it was, and it was so well camouflaged that even knowing where it was still hard to see. And that was the first time I saw a barred owl, and it was just sitting there sleeping. And now, like you said, we've encountered more barred owls, and um, there was actually one that's pretty close to our parents' house again that we went to see, which was a cool experience.
Yeah. Definitely a really neat owl, and they make the who cooks for you call. So instead of the like kind of the low hoots of the great horn, they make a more distinct kind of noise. We looked at the range more in the east, and then moving on to an adorable little owl that actually comes in a red morph and a gray morph. We have the eastern screech owl.
Yeah, I think Eastern screech owls are probably my favorite owl species now because they're just so funny. They're like little pumpkins in the orange morph and just little gray blobs in the gray morph. And you can find them just sitting out sunning themselves in tree cavities and in nest boxes without seemingly a care in the world. So if you know where one is and you catch it on a good day, it'll just be sitting out and you can kind of observe it for almost as long as you want. And they seem pretty content to just sit there. And they have a crazy sound that they make. It's that whinny and trill. Then it's a high pitched, almost horse like noise. And then this really cool. I don't even know. How would you describe what the trill sounds
It's
like?
like a rapid repeating note.
It almost sounds musical in some way, like some sort of synthetic instrument
Some
is
people can
creating it.
imitate it really well too, like just using like their, throat to do it. I haven't mastered it yet, but it's pretty impressive.
And I would say these guys are pretty common too, but you don't really see them that much just because of how small they are. A barred owl, while it's well camouflaged, or a great horn, you'll see them, out. Screech owls, since they live in tree cavities, a lot of times you don't even see them during the day.
Yeah, and I do specifically remember the first year we started birding, we asked to go to somebody's house to see a screech owl they had in their box. And basically, just as it was starting to get dark, they said, watch the nest box. And right before dark, it would pop its head out before it was getting ready to kind of hunt for the night. And so we just waited there and eventually it popped out. It was adorable. We got a picture. But yeah, very cute, very adorable. And if you are out in a forest and you see holes in trees, it's definitely worth taking a closer look. And hopefully you might see a little eastern screech owl hanging out.
It was really funny where it just wasn't showing itself in the nest box, and then all of a sudden just goes boop, and it's
Yep.
there. Just boop, the face is right there looking at you.
Yeah.
And they are small, but they're bigger than I remember when I see them usually. And we saw one recently? Oh, it was the South Texas trip. That's what it was.
Yeah. What were you going to say about it?
I don't want to give too much away because it's going to be seen in one of the videos from
But
it,
we
so I can't
saw an
give too much of a
eastern screech
spoiler.
owl. We heard
Yeah,
probably like six at the location we were at, but we did see one, not in a nest box, which was kind of neat,
out in the wild, out in
out
the
in the
open.
wild. And then their map, of course, the eastern, they're mostly in the eastern part. But there is the western screech owl. So that kind of takes that western half.
Yeah, there's also the whiskered screech owl too, which I think it's somewhere in the south. I don't remember the exact range map of that one.
I want to say like Arizona region, but yeah, we're
Something
most
like that.
definitely most familiar with the eastern screech owl. Western looks very similar too, and then you get into subspecies like in South Texas, you have the McCalls. That is the McCall's eastern screech owl that you
The
can find there.
westerns make a really different noise though.
That I've never heard. I've seen a western. I don't think I've ever heard a western though.
So I've never actually heard one out in the wild. I still need it for my life list, but I know that the noise they make is really different than the eastern.
Interesting. That's definitely something we'll have to look into. All right, moving on to, I would argue that this is the cutest owl in Eastern North America, the northern saw-whet owl. Common but secretive. They roost in conifers and they have a drawn out little toot call.
Yeah, and the first time that I ever saw one of these was actually at a banding station in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. There's a place where they catch and band these little guys. And I remember that we got to hold them, and they said to hold them like an ice cream
Hmm.
cone. So you kind of just, the head of the owl is sticking out, and you kind of just hold it in your hand and grasp the owl, and then they're just chill there. And one of the things that they said about them is they monitored if they get stressed out when humans are handling them, and they found that their baseline level of stress does not change at all. So I don't know exactly how they did it or if that's actually true, but that's what they said at the banding station is that they just don't even care if you're handling them.
Yeah, and I think that was my first time experiencing kind of banding. And so it was funny because they would take the owls out of the net and they would put them in these tubes, like the like pastry. You get those pastries that you can like pop open. They would put them in like those size tubes, and then like their feet would just be sticking out. So they couldn't open their wings or anything. They'd just be in this tube. And then they'd take them out and you got to like hold it and take a picture with it. And they were adorable. And then you got to release them like multiple people. You'd put your hands together and you just let it sit there until it took off. And I also remember that one, they had caught a long-eared owl. So I got to release a long-eared owl too.
I
And like
remember
I was
that though.
holding that and it was desperately trying to like get at my hand. And I was pretty worried that it was gonna like take a chunk out, but it didn't. And then got to release it. And that was pretty cool to experience as
I
well.
was a little intimidated by the long-eared owl. I don't know that I would have felt comfortable holding that thing because they're big and that bill is sharp.
It
And
was an experience.
even the saw-whet owl, some guy was like, "Yeah, I got a talon in my hand," and it, like he had a
It's
puncture
just
mark
his
in his
hand is
hand.
gone.
He was showing it to everyone. He's like, "Look at this, it got me."
Dang.
I think I remember every time I've seen a saw-whet owl because they're a very memorable species. There was one in Milwaukee that was seen, and some people found the spot that it was in, so we got to go see that last year with Will got to see it too, actually.
Will, friend of the program.
Friend of the program, Florida birder,
I
now
feel
Georgia
like
birder.
saw-whets are hard to find. Screech owls, I feel like people see a lot, and photographers love to go take pictures of them. Saw-whets are definitely not as reported as things like screeches, even though they're probably fairly abundant in certain areas. They're just a lot harder to
So
find
let's
since they're
change
so
their roosting
tiny.
location. So the screech owls tend to use the same nesting and roosting sites where the saw-whet owls don't. So a saw-whet owl will be in a place for a few days and then move to a totally different place.
That pretty much makes sense with how it seems to go.
Yeah, that's why they can be really tricky to find just because they won't stick around for a long period of time usually.
Yeah. But like also I feel like I just don't hear them that often. Like if we're out
No.
listening, it's normally the screeches, the great horn, the occasional bard. But saw-whets pretty rare. We that was actually our first bird of the year this year though, was the saw-whet and then a barred owl. I don't know if it was responding to the saw-whet or just being territorial. It was weird. It was a weird sequence. If you haven't seen the first of the year video, we did it was really interesting call series because it sounded like one thing, but it was actually two different species of owls in there.
Yeah, it was definitely very strange. And the saw-whets, they do have a little bit of a migration. So that's why sometimes you'll hear more or see more of them. There are certain times when they come through thicker than other times.
Yeah, so mostly kind of in the north and then in parts of the west, kind of missing in the middle of the US, except in winter and kind of the southern. It's kind of an interesting little pattern for those
It's a
birds.
weird range map
It
actually,
is a
because you
weird
see
range
that
map.
they're down in Mexico year round, but they're not really in the southern, the southeast part of the country, except in winter time. So it's kind of strange that they like to be in certain places year round, but doesn't seem like there's really a habitat preference in those areas.
Yeah, and this is the northern saw-whet. There's also apparently an unspotted saw-whet owl. Oh, that is a very limited range in Central America. Interesting.
I've never even heard of that. I'm gonna be
Yeah,
totally
yeah.
honest.
So moving on to our next one, we have the snowy owl. Definitely a fan favorite. They can be tricky to find. They love open areas. They're eruptive, so they'll move south depending on some factors as far as how many offspring they raised the previous year. And I often don't really hear them calling, but they make some low, raspy hoots. And this was an owl we had a cool experience with the first year we started birding because it happened to be a snowy owl eruptive year. So there were a lot of snowy owls around. And when we found out that this was something you could see in the state, I was just like in disbelief that that was even on the radar. I'm like, we can see snowy owls in Wisconsin. And now it's one of probably the favorite tour options for people that come and do tours is to find snowy owls.
Yeah, snowy owls are, of course, a big spark bird because it's just such a cool creature. I mean, an all white slash black barred owl that lives in the Arctic that you can actually find in the continental United States just sounds cool in and of itself. And they are really neat. And then another thing about them is you can actually see them during the day and they'll just sit there, they'll hunt. So it's a really, really special bird for sure. And we're lucky enough to live in a state where they do come down. And the first one we saw was at an airport. I remember that very distinctly was at the Waukesha County Airport. And then I think later that year, actually, me and one of my friends went to Freedom, which is a town where you can find them in the middle of the state. And I think we had like seven. So the
Seven's a
owls were
lot.
thick that year. Yeah, there was a lot of
Well,
owls.
before that, in between the two, we were at Marsh in Wisconsin, not even looking for them, and we were walking in some thick snow, and one just flew right across our path and landed on top of a snowbank. We had no idea one was even in the area. That was a really cool encounter because it wasn't even something we were looking for. We just kind of stumbled upon one. And I feel like that's kind of rare with snowy owls, just kind of stumble upon one. Normally you're searching for them or you kind of know they're around. So that was neat.
Yeah, and we've had them on numerous first of the year trips before too. Finding a snowy owl on the first is usually something that we're able to do. It does not seem like this is a good year for them at all in the
I think it's
Midwest.
been one of the worst in the past like 5, 6 years for them. The
So
numbers have
it's
just not
tough.
been high.
Yeah, it's tough this year. And there's definitely some people that reached out about tours, and I've been like, well, they really aren't around right now. So hopefully they can come in at least a few of them that are reliable later in the month or maybe even early March. But there's a lot of things that are interesting about these birds because you find them in weird places. You think of owls in general as being in majestic, beautiful locations, but snowy owls nest in the tundra. So when they come down here, they'll be in open spaces, so fields along the Great Lakes where there's a lot of open stuff that they can just scan. And sometimes they're even in more industrial areas because those will sometimes be open too, and they'll have a lot of rodents. So really interesting bird that there's a lot to know about, the snowy owl.
Yeah, it's thought that the darker barred individuals are females. The ones that are more white are generally males. The bright yellow eyes, they look like tiny little snowmen. So if you're searching an agricultural field, you basically just look for a tiny snowman. It's probably a snowy owl or a plastic bag.
Yep.
I feel like for some people, their rate is 75% of the time it's plastic bag, maybe 25% snowy owl, maybe skewed a little higher, lower than that. I think they look like the snow troopers from Star Wars, like the stormtroopers that are on Hoth, the really snowy planet. That's what they remind me of a lot because
Yeah,
they're
I can see
perfectly
that.
blended in with the environment. And then you just see like, those bright yellow eyes looking at you. But definitely one of my personal favorite owls. Always a treat to see, just like all the other species. Looking at that map, you can see just how much of that is winter range. And so the deal with snowy owls is them being eruptive. It depends on how good of a year it is for their main food source, the lemming in the north. So if is a lot of like lemmings, they have a lot of offspring, then there's so many owls they need to move down in further to the US. If it's a poor year and they don't have a lot of offspring, then they'll kind of stay further north. So an interesting case of why they move down is kind of based on their previous year's success, not as much about current food sources as it is with certain other eruptive species.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting way for them to migrate because, like you're saying, other eruptive species, usually it's plentiful food sources in the south and fewer in the north leads to them moving to find food, whereas it's not the case there.
Yeah. Next up, we have the long-eared owl, which, at least in Wisconsin, is a very, I don't know, touchy
Controversial?
subject. Yeah, controversial because they'll roost in groups. And if people know where the roost is, it can cause problems because photographers love to go there. And sometimes they end up harassing the owls, scaring them. They move around and then they'll leave kind of the site. So it's been very suppressed of the areas where these are, but it seems like word gets out to certain people and then it spreads between friends and it gets complicated. So it's kind of a controversial thing here, but they're a really cool owl to see and definitely one I don't see very often.
Yeah, like you said, there's that one area where people kind of know that they are in Wisconsin and southeastern Wisconsin, and I don't go there to try to see them just because I've seen them before and I don't need it for my year list. I don't really want to bother the owls, but one was reported at the lakefront this year, so it wasn't really a roosting site and it was kind of out in the open. So people got word out about that one and I got to see that one this year. But even that situation was really weird because there were supposed to be two of them. And then apparently at some point, one of them got picked off by a rough-legged hawk. And then the other one, somebody called a rehabber for, even though it didn't seem like it was injured. It was just sleeping out in the open, kind of trying to look camouflage. And I guess it flew into a building and then actually needed to be rehabbed. So they ended up taking it. So seems like it was just a debacle, but these guys are really sensitive, so it's tough to deal with them. And it's one of those gatekeeping situations where it's like if you stumbled on a roost of long-eared owls, would it actually be the right thing to do to tell anybody or not? You know,
Oh,
it's a
well,
tough situation.
do they show up on eBird in the state?
I don't think they do.
I don't think they do either. So you could put it on eBird. I don't think it would show up
I'm
public.
saying, would it be intelligent to get the word out to people?
Oh,
Because so
probably
many
not.
people want to see them. That's what's tricky is, they're a bird that if you see it, it's a really cool species. It could get you more into birding or conservation or something. But at the same time, there's too many people that want to get right up in their grill and try to get, a photo up their nose.
And I'm sure it's probably different in certain areas, but at least in our state, that's kind of how it's been. But I will say that they are one of the best camouflaged owls, I think, because just even in this picture, you can see the orange leaves and the tree branches, and they got the orange face and the pattern kind of camo look. There could be like six, seven long-eared owls in a tree in front of you, and you may not even notice one of them because they just blend in so well. They're really good at making themselves look thinner or, more puffed up. And that is one of the signs that you're probably too close to an owl is if you see it look really alert. Like it'll be really thin and then its eyes will be really wide and it'll look like it wants to flush. So if you're by an owl and that happens, definitely give it some space and back off a little bit.
Yeah, the term I heard is a sleeping owl is a happy owl. So you want those owls to look sleepy and plumped up and to not look super alert. But I've seen people get really close to owls and them not be alert either. So even if it doesn't look like the owl is perturbed, it's still not a great idea to get super close to it.
Yeah, you definitely give those owls some space, and just kind of let them do their thing. Looking at the range map, permanent residents in a lot of the northwest parts of the north, and then moving further south during the non-breeding season. And when you were there looking for that long-eared owl earlier, you had a short-eared owl pass through as well, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, which was a little weird because it looked like it came directly from the lake. So it probably came from somewhere, north and just was flying over and kind of looping around. Or it could have just come straight from Michigan, which would have been pretty funny. But short-eared owls in flight actually look very similar to long-eared owls. When they're perched, they look drastically different because the short-eared owls do have essentially non-existent ear tufts. So they look like they just don't have any, where the long-eared owl does have some pretty pronounced ear tufts. But these will live usually in grassland habitats. They're crepuscular, which means that they show up to hunt near dawn and dusk when they're most active. So that's a fun word if you didn't know that one. And they often are in groups. So not necessarily always hunting together or anything, but if you see one, chances are good that there's some other ones around too.
Yeah, I think this was my favorite owl species to be able to look for after learning about them the first year we got into birding because it's an experience. You show up at a known short-eared owl location right before it gets dark, and then suddenly a couple of them will come out and start hunting and flying around you. And it's really neat to be part of that experience and see them flying around, and they will make this little raspy barking noise, which I had never heard until going out to see them. So it's probably an owl that you can experience if you're in their range. Like there's certain areas where they're known to be, and if you go to those areas, you have a good chance of seeing them. So I think that's probably an underrated owl experience is the short-eared owl.
And unlike a lot of other owls, these are very acrobatic flyers. So, not that any owl is a poor flyer, but these will do some pretty crazy things and are really active hunters. So, they're not really ambush predators. They'll just fly around and look for stuff. They'll fight with each other in midair. They're just really entertaining to watch.
Yeah, it's almost harrier-like. They're kind of
They're
more
usually
like
with
northern
harriers too.
harriers.
It's like areas where the harriers are also areas where short-eared owls will be usually as it gets darker. I have known some people that have had short-eared owls just out during the day too, which that's a really good opportunity to get some photos of them if you're catching them at that time. But a lot of times they come out right when it gets just too dark to see.
All right, looking at that range, breeding further north, permanent resident kind of a band in the northern United States, and then moving further south. I know in areas like Louisiana, short-eared owls are really, really good bird to find because they're not often seen in those places. So you can definitely keep an eye out for them. But in places like Wisconsin, where we are, there you can find them in pretty good numbers, pretty much every year.
Fun fact about them too is they're actually one of the most global owls. So they don't just live
Interesting.
in the United States. They also live in Europe, Asia. I'm not sure if they live in every continent. I know they don't live in Antarctica, but I don't know if they can be found in Australia. But they are definitely a global species, not just here.
Yeah, pretty cool bird. Next up, we have one of the rarest, I would say, which is the Boreal owl. This is one, man, if it's shown up in Wisconsin, it hasn't been in a while, or it just hasn't been reported, but the Boreal owl. And we've only ever seen this species once, and that was in the Saxon Bog the first time we went. And I feel like we got super lucky, and we didn't necessarily appreciate it as much at the time because it was our first time going to the bog, and there just happened to be one there that we got to see. And then really the opportunity hasn't come up at all since then to even see this bird.
No, we were talking with somebody actually down in the Rio Grande Valley the other day, and they said Colorado is a place people go to see them. So there are definitely some places that you can go. In the Midwest, it's not a great place to see boreal owls unless they are having a little eruption and one ends up in Sax-Zim, or if you just get super lucky in the northern part of the state, in the region. A species that looks a lot like, in my opinion, a mini hawk owl, kind of if a mini hawk owl crossed with a saw-whet owl, but really cool species for sure.
I mean, hawk owl is pretty small as it is.
Yeah, but boreal owls are definitely even smaller.
Yeah, and when we saw ours, it was we got lucky because there was a big group of people pulled off on the side of the road in Saxon. And so we knew something was going on. We knew there was Boreal kind of in that area. And so we pulled over and people helped point it out. It was in some really thick, like vegetation to the point where if you'd passed by, you probably wouldn't have known anything was there. And it was just chilling, looking sleepy, hanging out and doing his thing.
The amount of people there was pretty wild. I know there was one year too that kept showing up at a feeder, so people got really good views of that one. So
We're
I
showing
think
up at a feeder.
it was showing up at a feeding station in Sac Zim because it was hunting the voles and things that were coming to the
Oh,
feeder.
gotcha. I was like, what are they putting in this feeder? It's
Well, I
just
mean,
attracting owls.
technically they're putting some voles and stuff in the feeder accidentally.
Well, on the ground, I suppose, but
I think it was the Admiral Road feeding station.
that's convenient. That's a pretty hot spot in the bog.
But people just
That's
got pictures of it totally out in the open, just with its eyes going, looking for food.
that's wild. So if you look at their permanent resident range, it's more in the north, and as Ryan mentioned, kind of comes down in the west a little bit. So they can be pretty tricky to find. Next up, we have the great gray owl, which in my opinion looks like a grandfather clock.
Absolutely
Definitely,
does.
definitely a majestic owl, mostly feathers. If you ever saw a great gray owl without feathers, it's pretty terrifying. But they're, I believe, one of the largest owls, but not by weight. So I don't think they're very heavy, but they're very large as far as size and feathers and tail to head.
Yeah, I think they're one of the tallest owls for sure. But definitely super light, which is a weird combination. And this is definitely one of the premier species to see in the Saxon bog too. Is if you go up there most years, you're gonna probably get a great gray owl. And they're another species too that they'll hunt at any time. So they'll hunt day, they'll hunt night. And I think a lot of that is a trait of these species that live so far up into the Arctic Circle that you'll end up with either all day sunlight or all day darkness. So they just get accustomed to, whenever they're going to go hunt. So you can see these actually hunting out in the daytime if you go there, if you catch them in the west too, where they live, they'll be out at all hours.
Yeah, a little fact check. It is the tallest owl, approximately 22 inches tall. So tallest owl in North America, despite weighing only 2.5 pounds.
Just 22 inches tall.
22 inches. I mean,
That just doesn't,
that's pretty tall for an owl.
I mean, yeah, it's just, I don't know. They seem bigger in real life than that.
Well, let's do a second. Yeah, about 2 feet tall.
I
So
think you
that's
meant 2 meters tall.
that'd be something. Let's see some of these other search. Can an owl be 3 feet tall? Okay, well, this says great gray owls are the largest owls in out of the ones found in North Central America. They stand almost 3 feet tall. 22 inches is not almost 3 feet tall. That's almost
No,
2 feet tall.
no, it is not almost 3 feet tall.
So we got some conflicting information. And then there's another question. Can an owl be 4 feet tall? The largest owls are a lot shorter than 4 feet tall.
I wonder how big the Blackiston's fish owl is.
We can check that out. I'm going to look at Cornell's page to see if they have a height on the great gray owl.
Well, I'll talk about the first time that we saw a great gray owl because I remember it. We went up to the Saxon Bog and we didn't go sleep anywhere. We just went birding as soon as we got there when it was still dark out. And the first bird that we saw there actually was a great gray owl silhouetted by the sun starting to rise. And then it flew right over by us. It was literally probably 4 feet away up in a tree. And we didn't go search it out. It just came toward us. And then later that day, we saw a few more of them, including one that gave good looks, which the picture of it is actually on the screen right now as the one on the slide.
Yeah, that was an incredible experience. And they're not too afraid of people either. So they would just kind of chill and hunt while you got to watch them. It's super majestic. Probably, in my opinion, one of the most majestic and wise looking owls. Cornell's All About Birds page says 2 feet. So that's about what we're going with there.
Right?
And then let's check out the fish owl because that's supposed to be a large one, 28 inches tall.
Okay.
So that's pretty huge. Let's see if that's the largest. Yeah, that's the largest. So they weigh, males can weigh between 6.5 to 7.5 pounds. Females can weigh 6.5 to 10.1 pounds.
So you could easily curl a Blackstone's fish owl.
But if you think about the great gray being 2.5 pounds,
Yeah, look how light that is.
yeah, that's crazy. And great grays are known for kind of plunging into the snow too to catch prey. So that's 2.5 pounds they're driving down into the snow. So they must kind of attack that pretty hard to catch prey that's hanging out under the snow.
It must be really cool to have a great gray sitting on you because it must just feel like it barely weighs anything compared to the size.
Well, people have been in experiences where they'll, because they're not afraid of people, they'll come over and like land on a camera or like, there was a from Saxon Bog a picture where one like touched somebody's head. Like it kind of acted like it was going to land on, and then it kind of touched and then moved off. So, it's possible one may just land on you and hang out.
Yeah.
Their range pretty restricted. You can see kind of that Saxon Bog area, permanent resident. More in the west, they'll come down. But yeah, pretty northernly owl. Then we have the northern hawk owl.
Another northernly owl, obviously.
Indeed, and these are much tinier than I thought because in any picture or illustration, you'll see it like full view. And so it looks large, but then you see that it's perched on the top of a little pine tree, like the top where you'd put the star on a tree, and it's not bending at all. So when I saw that, I'm like, these must actually be very tiny, and they are very small.
Yeah, and they certainly are, and they in the pictures look big, but that's not the case at all. And I do remember we tried to make a trip up to Door County to see one. I think I tried to go twice. Maybe we both went twice,
I
and
think
we
I
didn't
went
have any
twice,
luck
yeah.
finding it. One time was a disaster. It was like a blizzard out,
We didn't
and
even
so we
really
couldn't
know what
see
to
any
look
birds.
for necessarily. I feel like our chances of seeing that thing were super low looking back on it.
Yeah, we were just driving around expecting to somehow run into it, I think, which wasn't the case. And the second time we actually knew where to look for it and we just couldn't find it. But then the first of the year, I think it was that following year, we went and got one in Eau Claire, which was pretty cool. And that was one of, I think, two times only that we saw one because we saw one at Sac Zim. So I think we've only had two experiences with the Northern Hawk Owl.
I think you're right. They were both very memorable. And I know we've talked about this before, but we saw that one up in Eau Claire, and we were just watching it, and then that a falconer came with like some bait, and the bird actually flew in and landed on his hand. We were like, "What do we do?" It was kind of a crazy experience, and then it went back and hung out on its tree. But I know there is some issues with falconers. There's some rule where they can actually take certain birds like for their collection, isn't it? They can just take them out of the wild.
I don't know if they're allowed to legally. I really don't know. It looks like you're trying to Google it.
Yeah, we're gonna fact check a lot of stuff today.
I mean, I have no idea. It doesn't sound like something that'd be legal
I don't know. It's kind of like a Wild West thing, I feel like.
with
It
the
says,
Migratory Bird Treaty Act out there.
so this is just kind of random stuff that's popping up. But there's like different, if you're a general or master falconer, you may take no more than one bird of a threatened species from the wild each year if the regulations in Part 17, da 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 da.
It's weird that you're allowed to take any threatened bird.
Yeah. Well, that's why I remember hearing about it and it being so weird because, like, yeah, falconers can just come and take things.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was just the falconers or due to general harassment, but the hawk owl is another species that is suppressed, I think, in Wisconsin, and I think the great gray is too.
So here's something about falconers and peregrine chicks. This is from 2020. Conservationists have condemned the decision. This is from Patrick Barkham in The Guardian, saying conservationists have condemned the decision to allow falconers to take wild peregrine falcon chicks from nests as selfish and sending the wrong message. I'm pretty sure they are allowed to do some sketchy things and just like keep birds of prey and stuff.
Noted.
Yeah, so we definitely aren't the authority on that, but I remember it being kind of weird and me being like, they can't actually do that, can they? Well, apparently in some circumstances they can.
So you're saying you want to become a falconer?
No, I need to know more about the whole thing. If anyone's a falconry expert, please leave a comment and let us know what's going on with all that. But moving on, very northerly range for the northern hawk owl
Even
as
more than a
advertised.
great gray.
Well, they're not as much in the west, so it's yeah, pretty restricted as far as that range.
Yeah.
Next up, we have a bird that is not on your life list, although you may or may not have heard one time. The barn owl.
I mean, I did not hear it distinctly enough to call it whatsoever, but it's one of the coolest species of owl in North America, I think, the barn owl. And true to their name, they will live in abandoned structures, which I think is a lot of times where people find them. And I also think they're another owl that's actually global. And you can fact check that one, but I don't think it's just the United States that they live in. I think they live in other countries as well, or other continents as well.
All right, we will check that one out. But yeah, super distinctive owl, that heart-shaped face. Actually a very fragile owl. Like a lot of other species will prey on barn owls, which is pretty tough. But their call is terrifying. It's like a loud screaming. And if you heard it and didn't know it was a barn owl, it would definitely freak you out a little bit. But my experiences with barn owls is when I lived in Louisiana, when I was working on my master's, they were more common down there. They're like very hard to find if they're even in Wisconsin on any particular year. But down in Louisiana, they're more common. And so being out at night, it would be the kind of case where you would be with other birders and they would hear it or think they heard it, but I wouldn't hear it. And so I wanted to see one. And I was at one of the coastal woods and I was one of the first people in there. And there were a couple barn owls roosting in the trees. And so I happened to be walking through, and you would just see something fly from one tree to the other. And I'm like, man, that's moving kind of weird. And eventually I got a good look at it, and it was a barn owl. It was a really neat experience to actually be able to see those birds. They didn't stay in one place for long. They were kind of moving from tree to tree as I kind of went through the woods. And then that's another one I've seen in, I believe, a like church, like the outside structures of a church in Costa Rica as well. But definitely one you never get sick of. And then I have heard them during, I believe, rail surveys at night as well.
So I don't have it on my life list yet. And I don't know why, but I haven't tried that hard to go find one. Whenever we're somewhere in the South, I feel like we look for other stuff.
Yeah,
And
it's
I,
kind of not the priority normally, it feels like.
yeah, and I think I would want to see one other than just hear it. But they do have a crazy screaming noise, which I'm thoroughly convinced has been the cause of people reporting paranormal demons and things like that because of how horrible it sounds.
Yeah, we were on an owl trip and I definitely thought I heard one, but I don't think you picked it up. But I don't think you're going to count it even if you did as a herd only lifer.
Probably not, because I'd want it to show up on my needs list and things like that. And I've gotten definitely away from herd only lifers, other than a few things that you can't really see very easily and have a super distinctive nocturnal call.
All right, here's our fact check. They're one of the most widespread bird species on Earth, with 10 subspecies inhabiting every continent except Antarctica,
I feel like my facts have been dead on
from
today.
nationalgeographic.com. That's pretty cool. Very neat species. Very beautiful. There's also been thoughts that some of these, like the look of the bird, could account for paranormal sightings. Like I think was it Mothman they thought could have been barn owls, or
I think so.
yeah, they look kind of alien, especially if you see the juveniles. Like if you just popped your head into an attic and you saw juvenile barn owls, you might think there were little aliens running
They
around.
also like to puff themselves up too, to make themselves look a little scarier, do a little bluff. So you could see one of those if you didn't know what it was and think it was something paranormal, I suppose, like a ghost.
Yeah, we should try to get you barn owl. That should be our goal for this year. Probably
That's
not in
gonna be pretty
Wisconsin,
tricky.
but if we go somewhere else, we should make it a priority.
Yeah, it'd be good.
Yeah, well, pretty widespread in the US, certain areas where they're harder to find, but yeah, one of the most global owls. And then we had some more info on how to find owls. People are always kind of asking how to find owls, and it's tough because you do want to protect those areas where they are because you don't want them to get stressed or leave or something where they get eaten, or you just don't want humans to be too impactful on them, but you also want people to enjoy them, so it's tough. But kind of some general tips are to know the habitat. You can check reports on eBird if they're not suppressed, which some of them are. You can look for nest cavities. So looking for roosts as well with the screech owls, looking for those openings or the in nest box. And then with playback, there's a lot of ethics on if you should use playback or not. I believe it's in the Christmas bird count protocol. Like they want you to use playback, see if owls are around. But some people say you shouldn't use playback ever. Some people say you can use it all the time and it's not that negative. Other people think you should use it selectively. So it's always a debate.
Yeah, and the problem with playback is that a lot of times for birds, if you use it, especially when they're nesting, they'll get the idea there's a competitor in the area, and if they can't drive it away, then they'll end up leaving. So you could potentially push a bird off of its territory if you use playback at the wrong time and too frequently. But there are some other owl species in North America that we didn't touch on, actually, Derek. Can you
Yeah,
think of any?
these are the Wisconsin ones that this is actually from a presentation we did about owls in Wisconsin. So
But
we'll
I'm
touch on some of the
curious,
other
can you
ones.
think of the other ones? I have the list in front of me of owls
Oh,
that have
you
been
do.
seen.
Cool. All right. Well, a lot of the stuff is going to be the Western things. So flammulated owl
Yep. It's a
has
rare
got to be on
species.
there. Elf owl,
Yep. Known for living in
whiskered
cacti.
screech owl, we already
Yep.
mentioned. Spotted owl,
Yep.
ferruginous pygmy owl.
Yep.
Um, are you counting stuff that's rare for the US or stuff that's fairly
Sure.
common? Mottled owl.
Yep. You
Uh,
have two that you're
um,
missing.
two northern pygmy owl.
Yep. And
And
now
then
there's one more that's been seen, but it's not supposed to be here.
what
And
part of
it
the
didn't get
country
here by itself.
can get here by itself?
You did a video about it.
Oh, dang. Let's see. What
It's
part of the
escaped.
country?
I think it's New York.
Oh, the eagle owl.
Yep, the Eurasian eagle owl.
That's kind of funny. He gets like a whole spot on the list just because he's escapee. I still
Yeah,
see pictures of him every once in a while.
it's noted on eBird as not a countable bird, but it still is listed as an owl that's
Interesting.
been
He's
seen.
gets a whole eBird thing just for him.
And here's what's weird, there's been just as many reports essentially of the Eurasian eagle owl as there have been whiskered screech owl, flammulated owl, barn owl, northern hawk owl. So people must just be seeing that bird constantly.
Well, I think he's in Central Park area, New York, so there would be a ton of people to see him. For those that might be unfamiliar with the story, there was a eagle owl named Flacco that lived in one of the zoos in the New York area, and somebody like vandalized his enclosure and he got out. And they tried to catch him, but they couldn't, and then they decided he can just live there. So he's just been hanging out in that area and people see him and he seems like he's doing all right. So yeah, the Eurasian eagle owl,
There's one
Flacco.
more I forgot. It's the subterranean owl.
That's the name of it?
No.
What do you mean? Oh, burrowing owl.
Yep.
Gotcha. That's it? That's all the owls in the US?
All the owls that have been seen in the US in the last 5 years.
Continental US? There's no Hawaiian owls, are there? Except
I
for
have no
like
idea.
it's time for a fact check.
That's all that's listed though. So I'm sure
I
I
feel
would
like
think
one of the
some
more
owls would live
common
there.
ones lives there. Subspecies of short-eared owl is endemic to Hawaii.
That's
That's pretty
cool.
cool.
Yeah, there's nothing that's too wild.
I think
I
maybe
think the
barn owls live
rarest
there
owl
too.
right now is probably that mottled owl down in South Texas. If you're not counting the Eurasian eagle owl, because there's just one of those. There's just one of the mottled owl too that we're aware of.
All right, barn owl was introduced in Hawaii.
Very, it
It
would be
looks like
funny if my
you've
lifer
got
barn owl was in Hawaii.
it looks like you've got introduced barn owl and then the subspecies is called I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Pueo. Pueo.
Huh.
So that's kind of interesting. They have their own subspecies. But yeah, did you have anything to say about your experience with the other owls on the list?
I mean, burrowing owl was a really cool one. I've seen that species three separate times actually. Once in Kansas with you, I think. There was one that we were driving with someone and they picked one out that was sitting on like a post on the
It was
side
a
of the
clutch
road.
spot. It
It
was
was a
like
very clutch spot.
driving on at freeway speeds and they saw this and stopped.
Yes. And then there was one I saw in South Dakota in the plains. That was cool. And then we saw the one that was in Texas. That's now kind
The
of a
probably the
celebrity
most
that lives in a
famous.
cistern.
Yeah, it's San Benito, I believe, is the town, but it hangs out on this one cistern on the side of the road. Somebody said they thought it was probably the most photographed burrowing owl in the United States.
Probably. And we have two videos that have it in the video, and there's one all about it specifically. So if you're
And I
interested
think
in
it's
seeing
gonna
that, go
get
ahead.
a mention in the Rio Grande Birding Festival video too, because we went to go see it then.
So it's going to be in three of our videos, that one specific bird.
It's a pretty awesome bird. It's cool that it kind of has that known location. Doesn't seem like anyone's bothered it too much, which is good. But yeah, pretty famous owl.
And I think all of the other owls on the list, elf owl, I've never seen. You've seen that.
Yeah, the experience I
Spotted
had
owl,
with
never
elf
seen.
owl was it was roosting actually in South Texas. I believe they're come down in the summer to the South Texas area, but it was roosting outside of Benson. And they would have like a little hole in a like
Like a
telephone pole.
post.
Yeah. And so you could just go there before it got dark and it would do the thing where it poked its head out. My media of it's horrible because it came out pretty late, but it was neat to see. And then we've looked for northern pygmy owl, but it struck out on that one sadly, which is still one I really want to see. And then we may or may not have an experience with that mottled owl down there in South Texas, but you
Perhaps, who
may have
knows?
to wait on that one.
Who knows?
But any other owls on the list that we've seen but haven't mentioned?
I don't think so. We need flammulated owl still.
That seems like
Whiskered
a
screech
tough
owl.
one, flammulated.
With northern pygmy owl, we went on a whole expedition to try to see those and came up empty. Ferruginous pygmy owl. I never know if it's ferruginous or ferruginous. I've heard it both ways.
I air ferruginous, but I don't know. People can
I don't know.
chime
It
in on
just
that
looks
if
like
they
it
want
shouldn't
to.
be a soft G. It looks like it should be a hard G.
Ferruginous.
Yeah, but I don't know. People seem like they say ferruginous more often. And we had a whole discussion in South Texas recently with a bunch of birders about different things that people say one way or the other in the birding community, like species names, because you don't usually hear them said out loud until you're in a group of people. So like lazuli, lazuli bunting,
The plover
plover and
plover debate.
plover. Yep.
One that
Uh,
I don't have a firm answer on is crested caracara. I thought we looked it up when we decided caracara, but people call them caracaras, caracaras.
Yep, whatever.
Not
Any sort of
caracaras
syllable there.
though, but yeah,
And it was funny because we were on the search for some Bacards. We call them Bacards, and some people call them Beckards.
the
So it's just
Beckerderd.
funny. Yeah, Beckard just sounds really funny to me. And then we kept making fun of it, and eventually I slipped up and said it Beckard because I was just so used to saying it as a joke.
Did you actually? I thought you were joking when you said that.
There was one time I accidentally said it because I had been joking about it so much.
Yeah, it's goofy. If you have any thoughts on that, feel free to chime in as well. But yeah, lots of owls out in the US. Lots of ones we've seen, but lots that we haven't seen yet. So definitely going to be on the lookout for all those unique species in the future. And then owls in other, countries. I do have some owls from Costa Rica. Don't think I saw any in Grenada.
What about spectacled owl?
That was one I really wanted to see, but didn't get to see, unfortunately. Let me scroll through the old life list real quick.
I think the owl I'd want to see the most in another country might be the Blakiston's fish owl. What a strange species.
I think there's just something about a giant owl that seems really appealing. And I feel like it makes you think it wouldn't be that hard to find because of its massive size, but I feel like they're maybe harder than you would
Well,
think.
don't they live in Siberia and Russia or Japan? I don't even remember.
I
Somewhere where it's cold
I
though.
think Hokkaido, Japan, a friend of mine saw one. All right, so we got all the usual suspects. Tropical screech owl,
Ooh,
bear
what makes them
shank screech
tropical?
owl. He lives in the tropics. Yeah, those are the two. So tropical screech owl was neat, and that actually perched out in the open. I got to see, and bear shanked I also got to see.
Bear shanked.
Bear shanked, and those will be in a video, one of the Costa Rica videos at
Isn't
some
that
point
like
as
two
well.
years ago that you
I
went to
don't want to
Costa
talk
Rica?
about it. I got a lot of videos to work on, but a lot of cool content coming for you guys. So thanks so much for listening to this episode about superb owls. We hope you have a owl-ish weekend and that you enjoy the actual Super Bowl if you choose to watch it or not. Please let us know if you've seen any of these species before and which ones you're still on the lookout for. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider leaving it a rating and a review. That always helps us out a lot. And thanks for watching this episode of the Badgerland Birding Podcast.